Let's leave all the thank yous for Kurt this evening at the close of our assembly. Welcome you again. Welcome Paul and Barb back after their winter in Florida. And again this year they have returned bringing winter to the Ohio Valley with them again. Tonight, tomorrow night, and Friday night, some of our coolest temperatures in a while. But as I told Penny, I don't mind at all because I sleep better when it's cold. So I don't mind these cold temperatures. Mr. Klein, it's a great thing to see you here tonight. I assume you studied hard and passed your stress test this morning. You are here. Well, as here as you typically are, I guess. I got you. Deuteronomy Chapter 2 is not where I want to be tonight, and I don't know why I said Chapter 2, because I'm thinking Daniel 2 and Deuteronomy came out. And do you ever have that problem? I have it all the time, and sometimes it can be really embarrassing because I'm not aware that I have said something I should not have said, because what my mind thinks and what my mouth do don't always coincide. We've been doing online Bible studies for some time now, and I am compelled to listen to myself after each recording. And sadly, on more than one occasion, I've had to go back and completely redo it because I said something that I did not realize I said. Usually it's the quotation of a passage and I give the wrong citation. I may reflect on Acts 2:38 and cite Mark 16:16. The message is very similar, but it's incorrect and I have to take the steps to correct it. So don't be surprised when that happens. The book of Daniel, as we begin, introduces us to a number of characters that are prominent through the first three chapters. Of course, you recognize Daniel. You know his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by their Babylonian names. You know Ashpenaz as the chief of eunuchs, Arioch as the chief executioner, Nebuchadnezzar as the reigning king of Babylon. Babylon has defeated the Assyrian Empire and is now the dominant power in the Middle East. In the context of tonight's study in Daniel chapter 2, we're still dealing with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The king had a dream, apparently a recurring dream. We might call it a nightmare because it troubled him so greatly. He wants to know what that dream was and what it meant. And so he summoned all of his sage counselors, the magicians, the sorcerers, the soothsayers, the Chaldeans, and made two demands of them. Tell me what I dreamed, and tell me what it means. And of course their defense was, and they offered four arguments that said to Nebuchadnezzar, it's not possible. Nobody would ask such a thing. In fact, only the gods who do not dwell with men are capable of addressing the questions you've raised. And now Daniel comes on the scene. Daniel learns of the intentions of Nebuchadnezzar to destroy all of his counselors. And that meant he and his friends were destined for the chopping block as well. In fact, if he quite literally did what he said he would do, they would all be torn limb from limb. There are many bad ways to go, but that's near the top of the list in my judgment, to be pulled apart in that fashion. And the fate of these advisors seems almost certain because they cannot possibly meet the king's request And the king's not one to go back on his word. When he gives a command and it is not obeyed, the consequences will be suffered. And when Arioch, the chief executioner, comes to Daniel, he wants to know what's the hurry, in essence. Arioch explains to him what has happened, and Daniel, in turn, says to Arioch, there's a God in heaven, and he can do what none of the king's advisors can do. Give me a little while. So he shared the dilemma with his friends. They prayed about it, and God revealed to Daniel the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and what that dream meant. That's where we are in our study as we pick it up tonight, beginning in verse 25. Then Arioch brought in Daniel. This is the chief executioner bringing Daniel into the presence of King Nebuchadnezzar. He brought him before the king in haste. Now, if you are a really careful student of the Bible, you probably know by now that monarchs were not readily accessible to common citizens. And they were not readily accessible to even their advisors unless they are summoned. And in fact, we learn later in relationship to the Medo-Persian Empire that the queen herself was not accessible to the king without perhaps jeopardizing her own head if he's in a foul mood and does not want to see her. That's why when Mordecai said to cousin Esther, you may have been raised to this position for just a time as this, and you need to intercede on behalf of your people, her response was ultimately, if I perish, I perish, because she knew that her life was on the line if she went before the king and he had not summoned her. So this is the kind of backdrop that we look at the events that are unfolding here. Arioch now brings Daniel before the king because, of course, he's carrying out the king's orders, so he has access to Nebuchadnezzar. And this is the statement he makes. I have found, we won't go any further for a moment, I have found. Now, did Arioch actually find Daniel and discover that Daniel had the ability to meet the king's request? And the answer is honestly no. Yes, Arioch came to Daniel because Arioch was in charge of hunting down, so to speak, arresting and bringing to the executioner's block all of those whose fates have been sealed by their failure to honor the king's request. But when he discovers that Daniel can do what no one else could do because of the God of heaven, he is quick to say, I have found. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had promised rich rewards and promotion to the one who could honor his request. And I suggest to you that much of the motivation behind this exchange lies in the fact that if Daniel can do what the king desires and will be rewarded as a result, as the king has promised, if I'm the one responsible for bringing this man to the king, I may share in the rewards, and maybe even a promotion is in it for me. That's the way human beings have always thought. It's the way they still think, and for the masses, their favorite word remains, I or me. You remember in Acts when Paul was arrested, rescued from a mob that was about to pull him apart? When it's discovered that he was a Roman citizen, the centurion said, I rescued him, knowing he was a Roman citizen. He had no idea when he rescued him. He thought, in fact, he was an Egyptian and a leader of a rebellion. But now that he knows he's a Roman, he wants to ingratiate himself with the Roman authority and say, I did my duty and I have rescued this Roman citizen. We like to take credit for things. things. And that's what Arioch is doing here. And I will tell you from what this story says and what we learn elsewhere, that's really not very wise. You can get a whole lot more done in life when you're less interested in who gets the credit and more concerned with just seeing that good things are done. But Arioch says, I have found among the exiles from Judah, differentiating Daniel from all of those others who have already come before the king, I found this exile from Judah, a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, not to be confused with Belshazzar, whom we will meet in chapter 5, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? So it's a pretty straightforward exchange. All right, Daniel, can you do what I've asked? What's really significant, and I hope the lesson that we take from this text tonight is apparent to us. Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. Do you know he just validated the response of all of those Babylonian advisors? He confirmed what they had said to Nebuchadnezzar. There's nobody, no human being who can do what the king demands. Isn't it rather silly to demand what you know is impossible? But this is the nature of monarchs. They believe they have ultimate power and authority. Nothing and no one is above them. Their word is law. And whatever demand they make, it needs to be met or you pay the price. So Daniel only confirms what we already know and what the advisors have said. This is something that is impossible. No man can do this. And then he says, and this is key, but there is a God in heaven. Now, Babylon, like every other nation at this time, pretty much, with the exception of Israel, and it's not at this point technically a nation. It has been conquered, defeated, and its citizens uprooted and resettled elsewhere. Every other nation was pagan, polytheistic. The word poly means many, and theistic comes from the Greek word theos, meaning gods. Polytheistic, pagan, idolaters. And one of the things about idolatry is simply there's always room for another God. You can add to the list. The opportunities are really unlimited. In Acts 17, this is the problem Paul found at Athens. So religious were they that everywhere he turned he found references to pagan deities. And of course you know the one that served as the basis for his message there on the Areopagus was the inscription that he had seen to the unknown God. And that's just their way of covering all the bases. It's like folks, when they conclude their prayers, when they always ask God to forgive us of all of our unforgiven sins. We just want to cover our bases. And yet we know in our heart of hearts, based on what the Bible says, if we are faithful Christians, the blood of Christ is continually providing cleansing. And yet we still want to cover our bases. Well, that's what they're doing. And yet, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is different. He is real where the others are not. He is spiritual. These other gods are, in fact, non-existent. They have representations made of wood and stone and precious metals, but they're hopeless and helpless and ignorant. And still, people bowed down before them and worshiped. Those gods couldn't help. The astrologers, the soothsayers, the magicians, the Chaldeans claimed that they had a line to the gods. But if the gods don't exist, the line is worthless. That's why they couldn't do what was demanded of them. Daniel says there is a God in heaven. That is as true now as it has always been. It bothers me greatly that we are raising generations to believe that faith is a crutch, that there is no real basis for the acknowledgement of God. And we're reaping the fruits of that in society at this very moment. There is a God in heaven, Daniel said, who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to me, or has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar, what will be in the latter days. Latter days is a technical term that has eschatological meaning. That's a fancy word to say that it speaks of end times. But end times always needs to be understood within the context. When we think of end times, we generally think of the second coming of Christ, the judgment, and eternity. But throughout the Old Testament and much of the New, the latter days refer to the Messianic age. In fact, the prophecy in Joel 2 that God would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh in the latter days, Peter said, this is being fulfilled in Pentecost and Jerusalem in Acts 2. The Messianic age. It doesn't necessarily point to end-time events, which is what eschatology is all about. Eschatology is the study of last things. And when we talk about the latter days here, we're talking about the latter days of the Mosaic system and the beginning of the Messianic reign of Christ. And that comes into play as the dream is revealed and its interpretation offered. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. So here it is. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, I can't do anything. Your astrologers and magicians, and they were right when they said they couldn't answer the king's demand. But God can. I can't, but God can. And that's a significant statement on Daniel's part. It tells us why Daniel is so unique. You see, most men would be like Arioch. Arioch says, I found the man. Daniel, if he were like every other man, would say, I'm the man. But no, he said, I can't. But there is a God in heaven who can and will. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. Did you ever think about the future? I do. The last couple of months, I've been taking a break about every hour and just coming in here and walking around. I have found, as much as I hate walking, I can do some of my best thinking when I'm just putting one foot in front of another. Several articles I've written in the last month or two have come out of the walks that I make around the auditorium. I think about the future a lot. What's going to lie ahead for us? What does the future hold? And I don't know. I was listening to a couple ladies yesterday talking about calling the psychic again. They were just amazed. It was uncanny how accurate she was. She told them, in essence, that bad times were ahead for them. I just listen to some of this stuff and shake my head. Nobody knows the future. But we need to contemplate it and prepare for it. I don't believe we can live in the present until we've prepared for the future. So the point is, Daniel says to the king, you were in your bed thinking about what's going to come after this. And he who reveals mysteries, not me, that God in heaven who reveals mysteries, made known to you what is to be. So your dream was not the product of an imaginative mind. God was speaking to you, giving answer to the thoughts that were filling your mind as you went to bed that night. Well, that should have made Nebuchadnezzar feel pretty good for Daniel to say, God is telling you the answers to the questions you were seeking. You were thinking about what is going to lie ahead, and God in this dream revealed it to you. But as for me, here we are back to this acknowledgement. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me. I didn't figure it out on my own. It was revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living. I think when he says that, he doesn't want Nebuchadnezzar to draw a wrong conclusion. He doesn't want Nebuchadnezzar to think that education we gave those boys must have been really good, because here is one of them who's come through our school, and in 3 years he has mastered the matters to the extent that he can do what no one else can do. Daniel says, no, that's not the case. I can't do it on my own. But let's pause for a moment and acknowledge there is much which we are asked to do today that on our own would be nigh unto impossible. I think of the commission to take the gospel to the world. If that was just up to me and you, there would be little hope. But God goes with us everywhere we go. He gives us power to do whatever He requires us to do, and to do it confidently and courageously. As Paul said, He's not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. And any accomplishments that you may achieve, be wise like Daniel and acknowledge that they're only possible because of God. Because that's what Daniel's saying here. He has revealed these things in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, what do you think about that? Well, let's see. You saw, O king. So here we are. Daniel is meeting the first of the two demands. What did I dream? Did you dream last night? Would you like me to tell you what you dreamed? Obviously, I can't. That's not in the realm of possibility for human beings, not even professed psychics. But it's not a chore for God. Do you know He knows every thought we think? He hears every word we speak. Think about that. And Jesus said we will give account of every idle word in judgment. That's something to think about. God knows our dreams. He knows our ambitions. He knows our true heart, not the one that we necessarily present to the world, but the truth about us. You can see a person in a setting like this and draw all kinds of wonderful conclusions. And outside of this setting, they may be something entirely different. We'll never know about it. But God knows all, because all things are naked and open before the eyes of Him which we have to deal with or encounter, Hebrews 4. So God knows, and he has revealed to me, so that you might know what lies ahead, O king. Behold, a great image, this image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. That's why I said this was more than a dream. We might classify this as a nightmare, but one that the king has been unable to remember. But I would suggest to you, he has inklings. He seems to have some grasp of the fact that his dream had something to do with his kingdom and the future. And that is why it is so troubling. The head of the image was of fine gold. You can use your imaginations. Picture this image of a man. And his head is of fine gold. You all know what gold looks like. Polish it up and put it on a head. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar saw. He saw an image with a head of fine gold. Its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. What's the most valuable of those items? Obviously, gold. Now, if we were doing this in 21st century America, we might use platinum rather than gold, because platinum is more valuable than gold. But 2,600 years ago, there truly was a gold standard. That was the most valuable metal available. It's followed by a middle of silver, chest and arms of silver. I was looking today, every day or so I check on the markets for Greg, and I was checking today, Greg, thinking you might come in. You probably stayed about even today, by the way. But gold was up quite a bit, in fact, and silver was up just a little bit. Gold is around $1,700 an ounce. Silver is around $25 an ounce. You want a pound of gold or a pound of silver? Pretty easy question to answer, isn't it? Although I've never really understood the appeal of either, because you can't eat them. You wouldn't want to build a house out of them. Couldn't afford it. And I don't, from a personal standpoint, really understand the value of precious metals. I've never understood why diamonds are such an important thing. It makes no sense to me. Just a chunk of carbon. But women think otherwise. That's fine. But this is just how things were viewed. Gold is really precious. Silver is a little less. Bronze, we don't really think too much at all about bronze today, but bronze was very valuable. And even iron was not cheap. And in Israel, throughout most of its history, they were dependent on others. Remember when Israel had to deal with the Philistines? One of the problems they had is that they had no weapons. They even had to take their plows and have them sharpened by the Philistines. They had some files, the record says, that they could sharpen their sickles and scythes, but they didn't have the facilities early in their history that the Philistines had. And simple image. You look at his dream, and you've got this guy, and I don't know why he's standing with his arms crossed. I do that a lot myself because it's comfortable, but they tell me that that's bad posture, that you should never stand before a group of people and speak with your arms crossed, because it conveys the idea that you're not really all that concerned and interested in them. Be that as it may, this is a representation of his dream. There's a head of gold, shoulder and arms of silver, basically the stomach and thighs of brass, and then the legs of iron and the feet iron and clay. Well, that's what you saw in your dream, Nebuchadnezzar. Well, nobody else knew that, but God knew it and revealed it to the king through Daniel. So what does it mean? As you looked, he said, this is a continuation of the dream, a stone was cut out by no human hand. If it's done, but not by human hand. And don't tell me it was done by machines, because there were no machines that could do this 2,500 years ago. It is done by spiritual means. This would be an act of God. When a stone is cut out by no human hand, it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Now, if you want to take someone down, where do you strike them? You want to get them, wrap them up around the ankles, trip them up, pull them down, knock them. So this is where the stone strikes. When the stone strikes the feet of iron and clay, the whole image crumbles. But it doesn't just crumble. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. That's the hulls, the worthless material that comes in the threshing process off the grains. I liken it because most of us don't have any experience with that kind of process to popcorn. You get the hull. Do you know any worthwhile purpose for the hull in terms of popcorn and its use as a food product? I like popcorn, cheddar, jalapeno, caramel. I can't think of a way I don't like popcorn, but I hate the kernels, the hulls rather. They get in my teeth and my gums, and they serve no worthwhile purpose. Well, it's essentially that was taken off the kernels of grain, and it's very light, and they toss it up, and the grain falls back, and the chaff blows away. He said this destruction from the stone that was not cut out of the mountain by human hand, thus by divine action, just destroys the image. It doesn't just knock it down, it is ground to powder. Well, that's an interesting thought. You might want to read sometime Matthew 21:44 or Luke chapter 20, verse 18. There are two passages. They are essentially identical, both relative to Jesus as the stone that crushes and renders what it crushes to powder. You may say, is there any real connection? All the connection in the world, because ultimately that's what this is all about. That image that I just showed you a while ago, it's all about what God is going to do in the future in the person of His own Son. So, we've got this image destroyed by the stone carved out of the mountain by a divine hand, not human hand. It is of such power and the destruction so complete that nothing's left. But then the stone that struck the image becomes a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, the chief Babylonian deity was Marduk, and Marduk was thought to dwell in the mountain. The Babylonians would have associated the mountain with their religion. And this stone obviously has spiritual ramifications, which would have not been overlooked by Nebuchadnezzar as the dream is revealed and then its interpretation provided. This stone that comes out of the mountain, which destroys the image, then encompasses the whole world. What in the world could that possibly mean? And if I were left to give you that answer, I would have to say I don't have a clue. But God gave the answer to Daniel. And knowing what God revealed to Daniel, it is one of the most powerful stories in the Old Testament. I think I said to you earlier in this study that if you will honestly examine this book, and we're in the easy sections right now, but the more difficult sections from 7 through 12 offer even greater clarity to what God had in store for the future and why these things were to be as they were to be. And it all really builds around this stone cut out of the mountain that encompasses the whole earth. So what could we possibly be dealing with in this vision? That's where we're going to be when we come back next Wednesday night, God willing, and look at Daniel's interpretation given to him by God so that Nebuchadnezzar can actually find an answer to the question that was troubling him. What does the future hold? Now let me tell you very quickly that the universal understanding of Daniel's interpretation and its application was until approximately 300 years ago accepted without argument. For the first 1,700 years of church history, no one disputed the obvious message that this story was designed to convey and acknowledged that it was in fact fulfilled precisely as God intended, in the way He intended, when He intended. But because of that, people tried to undermine the credibility of Daniel and misinterpret the dream and its interpretation in order to avoid the simple fact that God knows the end from the beginning. Do you know the future? No. Does any man know the future? Daniel would say no, but God does. And He's outlined more than 500 years of history precisely and pointed to a time when this stone would be cut out of the mountain, destroy the image, and then consume the world, fill the whole world. And it's exactly what happened, and we're a testament to that in our assembly tonight. Only God can do that. So don't tell me there is no God. You can't explain Daniel without God. You can't explain this world without God. Why would anybody want to? Because as Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1, men worship and serve the creature more than the Creator. It's not that God cannot be seen and His will known. Men choose not to see Him and choose not to know His will. You can't do that if you understand Daniel. It just isn't possible. So that's where we are tonight. We will begin next Wednesday night, God willing, in verse 36. So